downtown, we have the Danvers Lunatic Asylum. This asylum opened in 1878 in Danvers, Massachusetts. It was part prison and part asylum. At its peak, it had 40 buildings, but could only hold 450 patients. But over time, the asylum started accepting more patients than it could handle. At one point, they had over 2,000 patients, but remember, they could only handle 450, so they were severely understaffed and the building was overcrowded. At this point, those at the hospital weren't getting cured. In fact, they were getting worse and worse. In 1939, a total of 278 patients died in the hospital, all from overcrowding. In fact, half the time, patients' dead bodies weren't discovered until days or weeks later. And if that wasn't bad enough, Danvers used to be Salem Village. Ever heard of the Salem witch trials? Yeah. A lot of people died on those grounds.
The lost souls of a Rancho Los Amigos brings us to number 9. This hospital is located in Downey, California, and although it looks inviting, it has a very dark and sinister history. Rancho Los Amigos was actually ranked as one of the country's best hospital in 2011, but it is also plagued with scary hauntings and paranormal activity. Back in the late 1800s, the building was converted into an insane asylum. It was built to house the mentally insane, homeless, and handicapped. The residents would work for physical labor in exchange for board and medical care. However, in the 1950s, it began to shut down its wards, including the mental hospital. People began to uncover some pretty disturbing things. In 2006, people found a freezer in the morgue that had mummified amputated limbs and brain tissue samples that were left behind from when the hospital was abandoned. So it makes you wonder what kind of treatments that they were doing here and what happened to these poor people. It is now rumored that this hospital is extremely haunted, and if you care about your mental and physical well-being, you won't step foot inside of the Rancho Los Amigos Hospital. The Athens Lunatic Asylum haunts us in at number 8. This insane asylum was built in 1874, and it was originally intended to treat people with tuberculosis. The hospital staff began abusing their patients due to overcrowding, and they would constantly hurt them both physically and mentally. There was even one doctor by the name of Walter Jackson who was a big fan of this transorbital lumbotomy. Okay, I'm not really sure what it is, but from what I'm seeing, it's pretty damn gross. Like, the doctors were taking this tool and going in between your eyes so that they can work their way into the frontal lobe. It's pretty disturbing and disgusting. So once they were able to get into the frontal lobe, from there, he would sever connections in order to correct their behavior. He performed over 200 lobotomies during his time. So as a result, there were hundreds of deaths that happened here. This hospital was so bad, it even has a permanent corpse stain on the floor because a body had been left there for way too long. Yeah, I don't think Mr. Cleaner or Bleach will help out with this situation. Up next, in at number 7, we have the tongue biter. A patient who tested positive for HIV and paranoid schizophrenia thought that the nurses at the psych ward were all trying to kill him. So as a way to protect himself, he would bite his tongue and spit HIV positive blood into their faces and try to get it into their mouth. Well, this actually sounds so damn terrifying. Whenever the nurses had to interact with him, they had to wear full masks, gowns, gloves in order to protect themselves. Yeah, this is absolutely insane. I bet his tongue is so damaged from him constantly biting himself. This sounds like the worst patient ever. We have another horror story coming onto this list in at number 6. Penhurst Asylum is located in Pennsylvania, and it was opened in 1908. This was a hospital for children, but it was barely staffed and it was poorly funded. So this led to a lot of overworked, desperate staff members who used a lot of cruel and unusual punishments. A lot of children were drugged, they were chained to their beds, isolated for days, and they had their teeth ripped out of their gums to prevent biting. A reporter went into the insane asylum to investigate how the workers were treating the patients, and in 1968 it was finally shut down. But the fun doesn't stop there. It is believed that this place is still haunted by upset children who were abused there. If you enter the doors, you can actually hear some screaming, you can hear doors being slammed, and uncontrollable crying. Number 5 takes us to the Waverly Hills Sanitarium. The insane asylum was built in 1910, and this was the place where patients with tuberculosis would go to get some treatment. But but they had no idea what was in store for them. Doctors at the hospital carried out painful experimental surgeries as a way to treat the disease. They would insert balloons into their lungs, and they also tried removing ribs in order to allow the lungs to expand. Yeah, I can safely say that none of these surgery techniques are being used today because they're absolutely insane. It's crazy, it's ludicrous. Maybe the doctor should have been admitted to the hospital because they were absolutely crazy. As a result of these surgeries, 64,000 patients died, and one of the employees hanged herself in the laundry room because she couldn't tolerate how the patients were being treated. The corpses would then be transported out of the morgue through a body chute, and a lot of the original building is actually still intact today. Slicing into number 4, we have the Metropolitan State Hospital. They opened their doors in 1930, and even though it was supposed to be a safe haven for children with mental health issues, it was more like a prison. Children would be heavily sedated on a constant basis, and they would be severely disciplined. In 1978, there was a patient named Anna Marie Davy, and one day she went out for a walk, but she never returned. 2 years later, another patient confessed to the brutal murder, and he brought the police to 3 separate graves where he had buried parts of her mutilated body. And if that wasn't gruesome enough, he even kept 7 of her teeth tucked away in his room just as a souvenir. I mean, how the hell does a murder in a hospital even happen? He got away with murdering her, cutting up her body, and digging 3 separate graves. Someone definitely wasn't very good at their jobs, otherwise he would have been caught a lot sooner, or that girl wouldn't have been murdered. Things get pretty gruesome in at number 3 with Topeka State Hospital. The hospital opened its doors back in 1872 for the medically and criminally insane. For nearly 100 years, they closed their doors because there were so many reports of abuse and murder. During its operational days, Topeka State Hospital was infamous for their elaborate and brutal treatments. They used to force their patients to become sterile. They used hydrotherapy and castration. A lot of the patients were starved to death, or they would be left in a tub of ice cold water for days. Some of them would be tied to trees, and they would be left for hours and hours. It's no wonder why the patients who were admitted here just keep getting more and more insane. Next up, number 2, we have the Arm Eater. A woman with a personality disorder was moved into a new room for closer monitoring, and that's because she was at a high risk of harming herself. This 30-year-old woman was struggling with mental issues ever since she was 8 years old. During Christmas time, she started to really struggle with her health because it was a really tough time for her. So she began to bite herself. And I'm not talking about just digging her teeth into, a little bit of skin. She would actually grab her arm with her teeth and tear flesh away. And we're talking like huge pieces. I don't want to get too graphic on you guys. It's pretty crazy. She would then chew it and then And she said that a voice in her head told her to do it. Patient gouges out their own eyes brings us to number 1, because why not? I came across this story on Reddit, and it was written by Never Got Challenger. This story is about their mother who used to work at a neuropsychiatric ward while she was in grad school. One night while she was performing her routine checks, she stumbled upon the most gruesome and horrific scene of her life. During the night shift, all the patients' bedroom doors were normally closed, but one room was different. As she turned the corner, she noticed that one of the rooms were open, and she saw someone's leg on the floor. When she looked inside of the room, she saw a patient who had just gouged both of her own eyes out with her bare hands. She was just on the floor holding her bloody eyes.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have the Lam Hospital. This hospital was built in 1972 and was designed to specialize in mental health treatments as well as physiotherapy. The designs for the building began in the 60s, and the building was created with quite a few structural issues. There were often leaky roofs that led to infection control issues within the hospital, which is exactly the opposite of what you want to happen in a hospital. They were usually understaffed, which led to the patients being given extremely high doses of oral sedatives in order to keep all the patients calm and to avoid any violent outbursts. But, of course, aside from the ethics of that practice, this would lead to substance dependence problems, which in turn led to more violent outbursts. There was a focus on security in this hospital, which could be a good thing, but it truly was taken overboard, and it ended up being more like a prison, which is extremely detrimental to those who are trying to heal. In 2012, the original Lam building was abandoned, and the hospital moved to a new location in Castle Peak.
Coming in at number 9, we have Alton Mental Health Hospital. Located in Illinois, this facility was built in the early 1900s. Sadly, they used a lot of unethical practices on the patients there, like electric shock therapy, lobotomies, and cold water treatments. This was just an everyday, normal practice at the hospital. Now it's said that this place is extremely haunted. It's still open to this day, and staff, patients, and visitors have all heard unexplainable noises, or doors will just randomly slam closed. One of the creepiest things that happened was to a nurse that worked at the hospital. She was in a room when she heard someone say, "Who's that?" She turned around, but no one was there. Then that same day, a different nurse went into the same room and she heard someone say the exact same thing. Lastly, a bunch of people have taken photos while visiting patients and have caught images and have caught orbs in their photos. One said the orb had a face of a human man in pain. In our 8th spot, we have the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum began operating in 1964 and was designed to hold only 250 patients. However, it was soon housing more than 2,400 patients, which was very problematic. The place was extremely overcrowded, and patients started to become more and more violent. Soon, they were starting fires and attacking the staff. At one point, patients were locked in cages or chained up to things like animals. On top of that, some were lobotomized with ice picks. Needless to say, hundreds died there. And guess who was a patient there? None other than Charles Manson. In 1994, the asylum was forced to close due to a lot of violations. Now it's said that the building is haunted by the souls of mistreated patients. Moving on to number 7, we have Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Located in Kentucky, this hospital was originally built in 1910 as a hospital for patients with tuberculosis. Sadly, tons of patients there ended up dying from the disease. The hospital did more harm than good. Rumor goes that the hospital was mistreating their patients and conducting experiments on them. It's said that 63,000 deaths took place there. In fact, they had an area in the hospital called the death tunnel or body chute, where they would dump the deceased. It's also said that one nurse hung herself in room 502, and in that same room, another nurse died from falling out of the window. Spooky. The hospital closed in 1961 upon the discovery of an antibiotic that could treat and cure tuberculosis. As a result, there was no need for that hospital. Coming in at number 6, we have Creedmoor Psychiatric Hospital. Located in Queens, New York, the Creedmoor Psychiatric Hospital opened in 1912, and it's still open to this day, but it doesn't have the best reputation. In the 1970s, rumors began circulating about patients being mistreated there. They thought they could beat the bad out of the patients. In fact, it's said that one nurse hit a patient in a straitjacket across the throat with a club, which ended up crushing his throat, and he died from asphyxiation. Shortly after, the asylum was closed and some areas were left to rot. We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with Fairfield Hills State Hospital. Located in Newtown, Connecticut, this hospital opened in 1931 to help 2 overpopulated mental hospitals in the same area. But surprise, surprise, this hospital quickly became overcrowded as well, and so they turned to unethical ways to cure their patients, such as lobotomies and hydrotherapy. Except they would submerge the patients in ice water, sometimes for more than a day, and they weren't allowed to leave. No, not even if they had to go to the bathroom, they were just stuck there. Needless to say, that made everything worse. Now it's rumored that this hospital is haunted, especially in the tunnels where they used to shuttle patients, the alive ones and the dead ones. In our 4th spot, we have Willard Asylum for the Chronic Insane. This is considered one of the darkest places in America. So it all started back in the early 19th century. Those who didn't have anyone to look after them, or those that couldn't look after themselves, were left in shelters. And the shelters were becoming more and more crowded. In response, they opened up this hospital for them. The first patient they ever received was an elderly woman named Mary Rote, who was suffering from dementia. As a result, she spent 10 years chained to her bed. Another patient was a young girl who arrived at the hospital in a chicken crate. The hospital soon became a dumping ground for the undesirable. Sadly, a lot of patients did end up dying there, and they were buried on the grounds in graves marked by numbers, not names. In 1995, when the building closed, workers discovered hundreds of suitcases in the attic of the building. These suitcases belonged to the patients who one day hoped for freedom, but but never got it. Coming in at number 3, we have the New Jersey State Lunatic Asylum. This asylum opened up in 1848 under the order of Dr. Henry Cotton, a man who thought mental illness was a result of body infections, which clearly isn't the case. So this belief led to a number of disturbing operations. He would do things like remove patients' teeth, stomachs, ovaries, colons, and bladders, all because he thought that if he removed them, he would just remove the mental health issues they had. But instead, he ended up killing a lot of the patients. Moving on to number 2, we have Penhurst Asylum. This asylum opened in 1908 and was meant for people with mental and physical disabilities. But soon they expanded and opened their doors to orphans, criminals, and people that just didn't have a place to go. But of course, this led to overcrowding, and it seemed as if the hospital wasn't run in the best manner. If you went there, you were classified as either an imbecile or insane. They truly didn't know how to help patients with mental illnesses. A lot of patients were just strapped to their bed. In fact, one nurse admitted that there was one patient who was bullying others. So, what did she do? She asked a doctor what she could inject him with that would cause him the most pain. And that's exactly what she did. She injected him with something and left him to suffer. Not only that, one patient was interviewed and asked what he would like most in the world. He said to get out of Penhurst. Thankfully, it shut its doors in 1987. And in our number 1 spot, we have Byberry Mental Hospital. Located in Pennsylvania, the Byberry Mental Hospital opened its doors in 1907. It actually started as a working farm for patients before turning into a mental hospital in the 1920s. Much like several other hospitals on this list, overpopulation and lack of funding led to patients being mistreated. In fact, some patients were forced to live with no clothing and not enough food. Typically, the hallways would be filled with sewage. Also, in order to cure the patients, they would be placed in solitary confinement, or beat, or subjected to electric shock treatments. In 1990, the hospital was shut down after it was revealed how horrible it really was.
Possessed Jane starts us off in at number 10. Jane was a new patient admitted to a psychiatric wing of a hospital. During the night, a staff member performed her usual nightly routines and checks, but when she went to Jane's room, she saw her sitting in a puddle of blood. As it turns out, Jane had been slicing off her skin on her shin with her dirty fingernails. As she was slicing her skin, she would pull the skin up her leg, which would expose her muscle and bones. I mean, what the heck is going on? Jane also had a nightly routine where she would need to touch every wall in her room in a crucifix pattern. But one night, a staff member went to check up on her and she saw her standing in the doorway smiling. The staff asked her what was wrong and Jane said, "What makes you think you're speaking to Jane?" I mean, oh god, I don't know how people can work the graveyard shift in an insane asylum. Anything can happen. Everyone is a little bit cuckoo. But you know what? I hope that they're getting extra pay.
In our number 9 spot today, we have the Kingchung Psychiatric Rehabilitation Hospital. Before I dive into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button if you're enjoying the video so far, because it really helps us out. This hospital is located in Shanghai and has a lot of history of holding patients long past their recovery. The most well-known case of this is the case of Su Wei. In 2001, Su Wei began to exhibit some symptoms of mental illness, and upon evaluation, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. He was treated for a short while and then released back to his family. In 2003, Su got in an argument with his father and ended up hitting his father, which of course was not okay, and his father ended up taking him to the Kingchung hospital. In 2008, Su's father passed away, so his guardianship was passed on to his brother, and since that year, Su has expressed his wishes to be released from the hospital, but his brother will not sign the discharge papers, so Su was kept in the facility for years against his will. He was even declared rehabilitated, but they still would not let him leave, which I can only imagine took an enormous toll on his mental health that he had been working so hard on. In 2013, Su finally got the assistance he needed from a lawyer and sued both his brother and the hospital, but after a year of delays, his case was rejected. Finally, after 3 more years of appeals, Su was finally declared to have full civil capacity and was finally released. It is then the account went totally silent. A year later, Dong's father finally gave an update and explained that his daughter had been taken into the 3rd hospital of Zhuzhou's women's ward after the live stream, and she was just now being released. He expressed his concern over her heavy medication, and he described her after the release as lacking vitality. I, of course, am not a doctor, but Dong was being given antipsychotic drugs that are used to treat schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, despite not being diagnosed with either, which just doesn't quite seem right. It is certainly worrisome that she was taken and treated and medicated at the hospital for an entire year, despite not being admitted either voluntarily or even by family.